I used to believe that losing control meant weakness, but nothing felt lonelier than being the only one always in control. The clinking of polished cutlery echoed around me, sharp and rhythmic like footsteps in an empty corridor. I sat still, shoulders squared, back straight, every inch the composed critic they expected. But inside, something was already beginning to shift. Not from the wine, not from the ambience, from the first bite. It was a small spoon, a chilled amuse-bouche, barely the size of a coin. But when I tasted it, cream, citrus, something smoky underneath, I froze. The air around me thinned, my breath caught, not from surprise, but from memory. That flavor, it reminded me of winter mornings, long before the masks, before I learned to turn desire into a performance, before I stopped letting myself feel. I looked up across the dining room. Just beyond the open kitchen window stood a man, tall, lean, focused. His hands moved with the calm of someone who knew exactly where every grain of salt should land. And yet, he wasn't looking at the plate. He was looking at me. Julian Moreau didn't smile. He didn't need to. His gaze held a question, unspoken, but undeniable. Did I reach you? I hadn't planned on letting anyone reach me tonight. I hadn't planned on anything other than another clinical review. But the heat at the base of my spine said otherwise. The waiter returned with the second course. I thanked him curtly, even though I could barely speak. My throat tightened with something I hadn't tasted in years. Anticipation. He watched me again when I took the first bite of the next dish. This time, it was richer, more layered. Textures folded into each other like pages from a book, only he had written. Impressive, I thought, dangerous, my body answered. Somewhere deep inside, a voice I'd silenced for far too long whispered, "This is what it feels like to be seen and wanted without warning." And I hated it. I hated that something as simple as a spoonful could undo the armor I'd spent years perfecting. That a stranger's seasoning could make me feel more than any lover's touch ever had. That in a single glance, Julian Moreau had undone me in ways no one else had even dared to try. He approached my table between courses. Not a word on his lips, just that same steady gaze. I met his eyes. "I wasn't expecting this," I said quietly. He tilted his head. "No one ever is, not when it's real." And just like that, the game began. I used to believe that losing control meant weakness, but nothing felt lonelier than being the only one always in control. It started with a phone call from a publicist I barely tolerated. "New chef in Brooklyn, soft opening tonight. He asked for you, specifically." I almost declined. I had a backlog of reviews to edit and a glass of wine calling my name. But something in her tone, half smug, half intrigued, nudged me. And so I found myself, an hour later, stepping into the garden, a modest corner restaurant tucked between a dry cleaner and a florist. The hostess greeted me like she knew who I was. That's the thing about notoriety. Everyone pretends they don't care until you're standing in front of them. Welcome, Ms. Hartley. Chef Moreau is expecting you. I followed her past warm brick walls and flickering candles. The space felt intimate without trying too hard to clean. Honest, the way a good meal should be. They seated me near the open kitchen. From where I sat, I could see him, Julian Moreau. He moved like someone born in the rhythm of flame and steel. His posture was upright, but relaxed, focused. He didn't notice me at first, not until the first dish was placed before me. It was a single spoon, perched on a piece of black slate, chilled cream, a hint of citrus zest, something faintly smoked. I tasted it, and then I couldn't move. The flavor struck something I hadn't touched in years, a morning in Paris, wet cobblestones, the scent of warm butter and rain. And him, I swallowed hard, not the food, my reaction. When I looked up, Julian was watching me. He didn't smile, didn't speak, just nodded once, as if to say, I know. The next course arrived. Warm, earthy, mushrooms and shallots tucked into delicate pastry. My fork cut through with barely any pressure. As I lifted it to my mouth, I felt the tension in my spine begin to loosen. Another dish followed, then another. By the fourth course, I was leaning forward, elbows on the table, something I never did. It felt like dining alone with a secret. Except he was there, just a few yards away, quiet, deliberate, devastatingly composed. When the final plate arrived, I almost laughed. A caprese salad, classic, predictable. But then I tasted it. The tomatoes were slow roasted until they surrendered all their sharpness. The mozzarella was impossibly soft, like it had never known refrigeration. Basil oil danced on my tongue, subtle and patient. Julian walked over, no preamble. What do you think? His voice was lower than I expected, rough in a way that felt intentional, like he'd been saving it. The tomatoes are extraordinary, I said. The mozzarella tastes like summer. He tilted his head slightly. It's all about the technique. The slower you go, the better it gets. There was a pause. He wasn't just talking about food, and we both knew it. I held his gaze. Is that your general approach, slow and precise? He smiled, just a flicker. Everything worth doing deserves to be done that way. Don't you agree, Olivia? I didn't answer right away. My heart had begun to tap a rhythm in my throat. It depends on the partner, I said, and I meant every word. Julian leaned back, not smug at all, just assured. I look forward to proving myself. He turned to go and, for the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about the review. I was thinking about the man who knew how to let things simmer, who understood that sometimes it's the weight that makes the fire burn hotter. The invitation came in the form of a folded note tucked beneath a wine glass at my usual cafe. No name, no signature, just a time, and a sentence written in deliberate ink. Come hungry. It wasn't a request, it was a promise. By the time I arrived at the garden, the main lights were off. Only the faint glow from the pendant bulbs above the kitchen stations remained, casting golden circles across the counters. The dining room was empty. The air smelled of rosemary and something gently caramelizing. Julian was at the back, sleeves rolled up, hands moving slowly, deliberately. When he saw me, he didn't say anything right away, just wiped his hands on a cloth and nodded toward the prep counter. "I wanted you to taste something," he said, "before it's ready for the public." His voice carried in the quiet, low and even. I walked over, heels clicking against the tile. The kitchen felt warmer than usual, not from the ovens, but from the silence, the kind that crackled with anticipation. "What's on the menu?" I asked. He lifted a copper pot and stirred slowly. "Something simple, but only if you're willing to be patient." I raised an eyebrow. "I don't do well with patience." "That's because you're used to instant heat, quick results, fire that flares and burns out." He ladled a small amount of sauce onto a plate and placed it in front of me. "This," he said, "has been simmering for hours. Low heat, no rush. The flavors don't fight each other when they have time." I took a bite. The richness didn't hit all at once. It built. Slowly, gently, layers unfolding like silk being pulled loose from a knot. Something sweet, then earthy, then deep, like memory. I looked up. Julian was watching me again. "You're trying to make a point," I said. He nodded, unhurried. "Only that some things, when done right, leave an aftertaste worth remembering." I let the silence stretch between us. The sauce still lingered on my tongue, stubborn and soft. "What about you?" I asked. "Do you take your time with everything?" A pause, then, "Only the things that matter." He turned back to the stove, adjusting the flame with a flick of his fingers. The room seemed smaller than before, or maybe I had stepped closer. We talked after that, about food, about control, about how people sometimes mistake speed for passion, and how the slowest moments often meant the most. At one point, he handed me a spoon and said, "Stir this." Our fingers brushed. I stirred slowly, the motion hypnotic, his shoulder barely a breath away. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about how to protect myself. I was thinking about how something so gentle could still make me tremble. Julian reached for the spoon, his hand grazing mine once more. But he didn't hold on. He just let the moment sit there, warm and full. "You're learning," he said quietly. "Learning what?" "How to wait." His eyes held mine, and I couldn't tell anymore if we were talking about sauce or something else entirely. I wasn't expecting to see him outside the kitchen. It was a quiet Thursday, the kind of day New York pretended to be slow. I ducked into a little cafe off Prince Street, my favorite hidden place to think, to write, to not be seen. And there he was, Julian, in a corner booth by the window, half shadowed, sleeves rolled to his elbows, one hand cradling a chipped espresso cup. The other was sketching. He didn't look up when I walked in, not right away, but something in him seemed to sense me. When I passed by his table, he lifted his eyes. "Olivia," he said, not surprised, almost like he'd been waiting. "Julian." I glanced at the pages spread before him. "You draw your food." Only the ones that speak before they're tasted, he said. He gestured to the seat across from him. I slid in. There was no music playing, just the low hum of steam, the occasional clink of a saucer between us, a notebook filled with ink and charcoal, sketches of plates, towers, curves, textures rendered with an artist's hand. He pointed to one, a layered structure elegant, subtle chaos, each tier smaller than the last, crowned with something golden and almost glowing. What is it? I asked. Still unnamed, he said. But I keep thinking layers of temptation. I smiled slowly. That's not a name, that's a dare. Julian leaned back, lips curving. Maybe, or maybe it's a confession. I traced one of the layers with my finger, careful not to smudge the ink. Tell me, I said, what makes each layer different? He looked at me, thoughtful. Texture, temperature, memory. I looked up. Memory. Julian nodded. The base is what comforts. The second is what excites. The third is what lingers. And the top, I asked. That's the risk, he said. The part that could tip it all over if it's too much. I sat back, watching him. That's an awful lot to ask of dessert. It's not dessert, he said quietly. It's everything unsaid, everything you feel but haven't named. Something in me stirred, not hunger, not quite. More like recognition. I picked up the sketchbook and closed it gently. You're not just feeding people, I said. You're letting them feel things they're not ready for. He met my gaze. And what about you, Olivia? Are you ever ready? I should have said something clever. I should have deflected. But I didn't because maybe I wasn't, not yet. The farmer's market was already half empty by the time I got there. Late spring sunlight spilled between the stalls, catching on crates of peaches, soft herbs, bundles of asparagus, still damp with morning chill. I wandered through, not thinking about him, not deliberately anyway. But then I heard his voice low, amused like it had always known where to find me. You're looking at those strawberries like they owe you an apology. I turned. Julian stood there in a dark sweater, sleeves pushed to his forearms, a canvas bag slung over one shoulder. His hair was tousled, like he hadn't planned on being seen. They're too perfect, I said. I don't trust perfect. He stepped closer, lifted a berry from the pile, examined it in the light. Sometimes imperfect ones hold more flavor. They ripen longer, wait for the right moment. I didn't respond right away. I watched him smell the fruit gently, without performance, then offer it to me. I hesitated, took it. It was warm from the sun, the skin tender, almost bruised. I bit into it, and the sweetness hit slowly, like honey melting on a warm tongue. No explosion, just steady, unfolding depth. Julian smiled. I was right. I wiped a thumb at the corner of my mouth. You usually are, aren't you? Not always, but I'm a good observer. I glanced sideways at him. And what have you observed about me? He turned, hands in pockets, walking slowly between the stalls. I followed. That you listen more than you pretend to, that you hide your hunger behind questions, and that you want to be surprised, even when you act like you've seen everything. I stopped walking. The noise of the market faded behind us, like a tide pulling back. You think you can read people that easily? He looked over his shoulder. No, but I can read tension. Yours tastes like restraint. I caught up, trying to laugh, but the sound came out softer than intended. And yours? I asked. He looked ahead again. Mine tastes like patience, like a dish I've been slow cooking for years, waiting for the right appetite. We reached the end of the row, past the vendors, past the chatter, just sunlight, and the smell of citrus in the air. I looked at his hands, the way they moved, unhurried, intentional. You work with your hands every day, I said. Do you ever stop to wonder how much power they hold? He turned to me fully then, no teasing, no detour. You've been wondering that since the moment we met. The silence between us deepened, like a slow inhale before something irreversible. But neither of us moved. Instead, we turned back toward the stalls, walking side by side, close but untouched. And for the first time, I realized it wasn't just about what I wanted from him. It was about how long I was willing to wait, to taste something real. There are things we never say out loud, not because we're afraid others won't understand, but because we know they will. That night, I sat in my apartment with the windows open, letting the air roll in thick with spring and city dust. The lights stayed off. Only the glow from my laptop illuminated the room, casting everything in quiet blue. I opened a new document, typed his name, then deleted it instead. I wrote about time, how flavors deepen when they're allowed to rest, how fire, when too aggressive, burns instead of builds, how the softest heat can sometimes melt what the sharpest blade never could. The words weren't for publication. They weren't even for him. They were for me. I kept writing, a private review, one I never intended to print, about the meal, about him, about how each course had felt like he was offering not food, but pieces of himself, seasoned, honest, careful, never rushed. And I hated how much it had moved me, because I had made rules, I had drawn lines, and he hadn't crossed them. No, that would have been easier. Julian had waited, stayed in his lane, never once pushed, and somehow that was worse. I stared at the blinking cursor, then saved the file and closed it. Across the room, on my small kitchen counter, sat a white pastry box. No label, no card, just my name written in black ink. It had arrived earlier, left with the doorman. Inside was a small tart, orange segments arranged like petals, glazed with something clear and fragrant. I leaned in, inhaled orange peel, star anise, something faintly spiced, like a memory tucked under warm fabric. The scent stopped me cold. I hadn't smelled that combination since I was 23. The first winter I spent with someone who'd promised forever and delivered nothing, who kissed like sugar and lied like smoke. I pushed the box away, harder than I meant to, but the scent stayed. I stood for a long time in that kitchen, hands braced on the counter, staring at that quiet offering. No name, no explanation, just something crafted gently, intimately, something that said, "I see you, even if you won't look at me." And still, I didn't eat it, not yet. I walked into the garden unannounced. It was early afternoon, quiet between lunch and dinner. The kitchen wasn't bustling yet, just a few staff prepping vegetables, the dull thud of knives against boards, the soft whir of mixers in the background. Julian stood near the back, facing away, rolling dough between his palms. I didn't wait for him to notice me. "You should have asked." He turned slowly. "Asked what?" "To send me something that personal, that specific. You don't know what that flavor means to me." His expression didn't change. He set the dough aside, wiped his hands on a towel, and leaned back against the counter. "I didn't send a memory," he said. "I sent a dessert." "It wasn't just a dessert," I snapped. "You knew what it would do." "I hoped," he corrected. "There's a difference." I hated how steady he looked, how calm, like he hadn't just cracked open something I'd spent years sealing shut. I folded my arms. "What gives you the right to get in my head like that?" He shook his head. "I didn't go into your head. I stayed in my kitchen. You came to me." The silence stretched thin between us. I looked away, toward the prep station. A pot of stock simmered there, low and gentle, filling the room with warmth I didn't want to feel. "I don't like being vulnerable," I said, quieter now. "Especially not with someone who knows how to hide behind flavors and metaphors." Julian pushed off the counter and took a few steps closer. Not enough to threaten, just enough to be heard without effort. "I'm not hiding. You think I'm subtle because I do push. That's not distance, Olivia. That's respect." Something in me flinched. He kept going. "You've built walls so high, you mistake gentleness for manipulation. You call silence a tactic, but maybe, just maybe, not everything is strategy." I stared at him, at the steadiness in his voice, the steadiness I'd wanted to believe was performance, because the alternative was too risky. "I'm not asking for control," he said. "I'm offering presence. There's a difference." I wanted to shout, to say something that would snap him back into the neat little box I'd labeled him with instead. All I could do was whisper, "It's too much." Julian's voice softened. "Or maybe it's just finally enough." I didn't answer. I turned and walked out, the sound of simmering broth chasing me down the hall. The distance began like steam, quiet, invisible, but heavy in the air. I stopped going to the garden, stopped answering unknown numbers, stopped walking routes that might lead me past Prince Street. And Julian, he didn't chase me. That should have been a relief. Instead, I found myself haunted by the absence of pursuit. Days blurred. My apartment felt too large, too still. I spent hours editing other writers' words, adjusting commas no one would notice. At night, I scrolled through old reviews I'd written, looking for signs of the woman who had once known exactly what she wanted. But I couldn't find her. I went out, tried other restaurants, tried to fill the space. Each meal was beautiful, technical, pleasing, and utterly forgettable. Nothing lingered. One night, I sat in a small bistro in Soho, staring at a plate of delicate duck confit and realized I couldn't taste anything because nothing about it had been made for me, not like his food. Julian's dishes had always felt personal, not because they begged to impress, but because they understood what silence tasted like, what waiting could become, if you let it soften instead of harden. At the market that weekend, I caught myself reaching for rosemary, then pulled my hand back like it had burned me. Even the herbs remembered him. And then, weeks later, it happened. A gallery opening, crowded, dimly lit. I was there out of obligation, wine in hand, smiling without meaning it. I was halfway through a meaningless conversation when I felt it, that unmistakable shift in the air, the pull. I turned. He was across the room, still composed, but his eyes found mine without hesitation. He didn't move, just reached into his jacket and placed something on the wine bar beside him. A small, folded card. Then he walked away. I waited until the room swallowed him whole before I crossed over. I opened the card. 2 words written in his precise, careful script, "Come hungry." And below that, a time, no address, just faith that I'd know exactly where to go. I arrived 5 minutes late on purpose. His building was tucked between a row of weathered brownstones, the kind of place that whispered more than it revealed. No doorman, just a rust-colored door, and my own reflection staring back at me from the brass handle. I knocked once. The door opened before I could knock again. Julian stood there barefoot, shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, the same calm in his eyes, but softer now, less guarded. "Olivia," he said. I stepped inside. The apartment smelled like rosemary and browned butter. Something citrusy lingered beneath it, like warmth curling around the edges of winter. The space was simple, open kitchen, long wooden table, shelves lined with cookbooks and clay pots. The only light came from under-cabinet fixtures and one old lamp near the window. Everything else was shadows and quiet. "You're cooking," I said. He nodded. "Only one dish, just for tonight." I followed him into the kitchen, watching the way he moved. No performance, just presence. He gestured toward a single plate already set at the counter. "I didn't make a menu," he said, "just this." I looked down. A warm, shallow bowl, steam rising slow and fragrant, something familiar and not. I couldn't name it, but I felt it. He placed a silver spoon beside it. I didn't sit yet. "What is it?" I asked. Julian leaned back, crossed his arms lightly. "It's not perfect, but it's mine." The quiet between us felt different tonight, not tense, not withheld, just honest. I met his gaze. "I didn't come here for perfect." I picked up the spoon. The broth touched my lips like a story told only once. It was deep, comforting, with something sharp at the end, like truth catching in the throat. I closed my eyes. Julian didn't speak. He didn't need to. I finished slowly, savoring the last drop, then set the spoon down and looked at him. "It tastes like something I thought I'd never feel again," I said. He didn't ask what. He just stepped closer, not touching, just near enough for the air between us to shift. "What happens now?" he asked. I let the quiet answer first. Then, softly, I unlock the door, and you decide if you're ready to come in. The light in the room dimmed to a hush. No music, no words, just the soft rustle of the city breathing beyond the glass. He stepped into the space I'd opened for him, careful, like entering sacred ground. I didn't move back. I didn't brace. For the first time, I let the air between us carry all the weight. Julian's presence felt like warmth arriving in waves, not sudden, not overwhelming, but steady. A slow tide against shorelines long left, untouched. He reached out not for my body, but for the silence. And I let him have it. The energy shifted, wrapping around us like smoke in sunlight. Each glance held longer than the last, each breath in sync, until we weren't just standing, we were suspended. A moment poured carefully, like wine coaxed from a bottle aged in darkness. He didn't speak, neither did I. There was no need. Every motion between us moved like a symphony written in stillness. The soft clink of porcelain, the creak of wood beneath weight shifted closer, the gentle sigh of fabric giving way. And then contact, not of skin, but of intention. A current passed through me, quiet and deep, like finding the key to a room I thought had crumbled. Inside it, warmth, ache, hunger, and something softer, like trust blooming too late in the season, but still, somehow, surviving. His breath was near mine, not urgent, just aligned, and when our mouths finally met, it wasn't a collision. It was a translation, a language neither of us had dared to speak until now. I felt the universe narrow to this one rhythm, his hands not claiming, but holding space, my heart not racing, but remembering. And as the night unfolded, layer by careful layer, what passed between us wasn't about need. It was about knowing, like savoring a dish where every flavor had waited, just long enough outside. Dawn stretched into the skyline. I touched his shoulder, barely above a whisper. "Let us not call this dessert," I murmured. He looked at me, eyes steady, quiet. "Let's call it a beginning." I didn't write the review, not the official one, anyway. The draft still sat untouched in my files, full of words I could never publish without unraveling myself in public. So instead, I opened a new document, a blank page, and I wrote something else entirely. Not a critique, a confession, about flavors that held silence, about heat that didn't burn but coaxed, about the kind of hunger that wasn't about appetite, but about being seen and fed exactly where you were most empty. I started a blog that week, anonymous, quiet, tucked into the corner of the internet, where no one expected to find honesty from someone like me. I called it the slowest course. Each post was a small offering, not just about food, but about memory, sensation, that delicate moment between the first bite and the one you realize you've been waiting your whole life for. Julian never asked what I'd written, and I never told him. He didn't need the words. He had always spoken in flavor, weeks past. The world resumed its pace. Critics came and went. Reservations at the garden became impossible to get without knowing someone who knew someone. One evening, I walked past the restaurant. I hadn't meant to, my feet simply turned inside. The kitchen buzzed. Staff moved with practiced grace. And in the middle of it all still, grounded, stood Julian, focused, unbothered, entirely himself. He looked up, like he felt me before he saw me. Our eyes met through the glass. And just like always, he didn't wave, didn't call out, he simply nodded, once. A gesture filled with memory and promise. I nodded back and kept walking, not because I was leaving anything behind, but because something had already begun. Not a climax, not a finish line, just a quiet, unfolding truth. Sometimes the most satisfying course is the one you're still savoring.